Hello, today I'm going to be talking about sensitive periods in early childhood development, an opportunity to be seized. So the first slide just shows that ability to learn or plasticity in our brain is highest when we're first born. We have the most number of neurons and synapses at age when we're born, and the effort to learn new skills is the lowest. So obviously the most optimal time to learn, and one would argue invest, is early in our preschool years or even prior. So here's the graph showing the rate of return on human capital investments based on age. Now, in reality, it's not actually this simple because the sensitivity and the critical periods are different for each skills, and it's not as linear as this. Now, this is how our society focus our resources. We tend to focus on the later stages of life. Now, imagine how much it costs to put someone in prison or the university costs versus their preschool costs. So this brings me to the concept of sensitivity and critical period. So sensitivity period can be defined as a time in development during which the brain is particularly responsive to experiences, whereas critical period is the presence or absence of experience resulting in irreversible changes. So in other words, if a child does not receive appropriate stimulation during a critical period, the ability to learn a given skill or trait may be difficult or even impossible to develop later in life. So this is just a graph showing your brain development. We have different types of brain cells in our brain, and they all develop and mature at different rates. This is just a broad overview of the different sensitive and critical periods. Now this may vary between each child, and the length of these critical and sensitive periods may also vary between individuals. Here it is again, except in more details. So here's a graph showing the sensitive periods for hearing, vision, emotional control, habitual way of responding, numbers, peers, social skills. As you can see, they have different start time for the sensitive periods and different, how should I put it, ending time or optimal learning time for those sensitive periods. So you can see vision and hearing and habitual way of responding, the peaks, you learn the optimal learning actually occurs very early on within the first few years of life, whereas learning numbers and peer social skills, occurs later on and sort of that period lasts a bit longer. On the other graph, you can see, obviously, as we age, our working memory, speed of processing decreases, and our knowledge in general increases. We can use an example of vision where when cats or kittens, when they're born, they cover one eye and only let the other eye stimulate with light. And when they remove the patch from the eye after a period of time, they realize that the cat can no longer see through that eye that was covered up. Although that eye that was covered up never doesn't have any anatomical pathologies to it, it just can't see, so it becomes functionally blind. So this is the sensitive period for learning language. And some of these sensitive period, as you can see from previous examples, starts very early and closes down quite early too. For example, vowels you learn within the first 6 months of your life, and consonants the first 12 months. afterwards it becomes more difficult to hear difference between phenoms. So there is small number of case reports that shows that neglected children that has been exposed to little language in their early childhood will intervene with a rich language environment. However, after several years, these children were not able to achieve the same level of adult abilities. And we can also think about children that move to different, or even when they learn new language, in general, after the age 4, if you learn a new language, you may still develop an accent. Here's an example on your emotional learning in the early years. So yeah, there is a sensitivity period for your amygdala, or your emotional part of your emotional center. In this study, they looked at children of mothers with clinical depression and found that there are greater risk of developing depressions themselves. And they suspect it's due to altered brain processing of the reward pathway due to decreased positive interactions with their parents. What are some pro-social behaviors that we can help our children, which are very basic things such as acknowledgement, imitation, elaboration of child's positive emotional expressions, avoid talking to them in a dismissive manner, or invalidation or punitive response. This graph just shows that the cases of allergies are on the increase between the 0 and the 4-year-old group, mostly in developed countries. So this is the hygiene hypothesis, and they believe it's a balance between different factors. So if you live in a westernized country, in a small family, and you're affluent in an urban environment, you're probably more at risk of developing allergies compared to if you're living in a developing country with large family, rural home, living with animals, and with low use of antibiotics and poor sanitization and high oral fecal burden. This is just showing that early exposures to peanuts can decrease your risk of developing peanut allergies. So it just shows that if you're exposed to peanuts between 4 to 11 months, you're at decreased risk of developing peanut allergies. And this is just showing that how our microbiome in our gut may increase or decrease the risk of your milk allergies depending on its composition of your microbiota. So this study looks at environmental and demographical risk factors for developing egg allergies. So there are many things that may influence it, such as the number of siblings you have. The more siblings you have, the decreased risk of developing egg allergies. The more cats and dogs that you have allowed to live inside in the same house, a decreased risk of developing egg allergies. Developing allergy can be quite a complex system. So, for example, if you have like decreased vitamin D when you're born, you may have increased risk of developing food allergies. And here's the complex immunological pathway. Here are some common food allergies. You may consider exposing these to your young babies earlier rather than later. I recommend consulting an immunologist if you have concerns. Here's just a random recent case study I found about how these microbiotas in our gut can influence many things in our life. And in this case study, they looked at individuals with diagnosed bipolar disorder, and they changed their microbiota through changes in diet and fecal transplant. And surprisingly, after a period of time, their bipolar disorder improved to a point that they no longer need medications. Here are some prenatal factors associated with increased risk of psychopathologies, such as ADHD, anxiety, depression, autism, and schizophrenia. As you can see, a lot of factors here are outside our control, such as being from low SES, discrimination, early childhood adversity. Here's a study showing that maternal support in early childhood predicts larger hippocampus volume at school age. This is a nice picture showing pretty much that we just need to protect our children from early childhood adversity. At birth, we really want to focus on being nurturing and having a predictable environment and being sensitive to our children. And later on, maybe when they're around age 2, we really want to help them with stimulation, adequate sleep, good diet, and from age 3 onwards, more about the emotional teaching and focusing on your parent-child interactions and giving them that autonomy. Some example of early childhood adversity include exposure to poverty, stress, abuse, neglect, and obviously these all have impacts on the brain. Good supportive caregiver may buffer some of these effects. Different brain regions myelinate at different times and are experience dependent. And the pruning of the brains also has timely varies. So the study basically goes on to say that at preschool, if you're experiencing early childhood adversity, affects different part of the brain compared to when you go to school and you're experiencing ACE. And maternal support during these different times can help with different regions as a result. And we can see it in graph form here and here. So this links nicely to this book called The Orchid and the Dandelion. If we had a look at the previous graph, you can see that the dots are scattered throughout the graph, and we can definitely say that there's large variations between individuals. And the book use an analogy of orchids and dandelions. Dandelions could be thought as flowers that are sturdy and more resistant to harsh environments, whereas orchids are more fragile type of flowers that needs a more controlled environment, more of a nurturing environment. And if it receives those nurturing environment, it may blossom and look nice. And yes, whereas if the orchid receives a pretty poor environment, it may wither and die. So the book looked at, for example, the amount of fight and flight response and cortical release based on children exposed to the same environmental stresses, and it characterized children with high flight or cortical response as orchids, and dandelions as children with low fight or flight or cortical release response, and they're all exposed to the same stresses. And what they found was that, for example, they looked at respiratory illnesses and found that, for example, orchids, if they have a good family situation, they tend to have less respiratory illnesses compared to all their peers, including the dandelions. Whereas if they have experienced a lot of stress, these kids also have the highest rates of respiratory illnesses. So dandelion could either be, have the lowest amount of respiratory illness, or the highest depending on their social environment, whereas dandelions tend to be more of like a dose dependent, as in they don't really have that much respiratory illness, and it does go up, but to a lesser rate compared to orchids. So here's an example based on monkeys. Then they also test their stress response and categorize the monkey as either orchid-like or dandelion-like, and put them in a high stress environments and look at how much injuries they suffer. So in a low stressful environment, the dandelions suffer the least, the orchids suffer the least amount of injuries on the period of low stress. But in periods of high stress, high confinement, they had the most type of injuries compared to their peers. This is a study showing looking at Romanian institutionalized children and comparing to when they were adopted, at what age. And obviously the early adopted ones show higher IQ than later adopted ones. But having said that, even the early adopted one had lower IQ than the control. And this was another study looking at those Romanian institutionalized children and how they perform in other tasks. And obviously the institutionalized children score poor pretty much in our domain compared to the early adopted, which again is lower compared to the control. This was a study looking at early life adversity and how it epigenetically regulates stress response. I read in another research in that early life experience can either upregulate HPA axis or severely downregulated. So some individuals may be more emotional, whereas others become less emotional. Mhm. Some of that could be buffered by having a supportive relationship. This was a nice summary paper about the first 1000 days, which actually starts at conception, and how epigenetic changes how the environment can change your gene expressions. That has effect throughout your life. And just list some potential, environmental factors. Oh yeah. It's well known that telomeres shorten with each cell division, but also through adverse experience such as trauma, war, poverty, neglect, early childhood adversities. And telomere length has been shown to be associated with some increased risk of disease, which are these, and some cancers, such as these, and other diseases there. So this will be a final article that I'll touch on today. And basically, this article here suggests that if you want to teach your child a musical instrument, it is best done before the age of 7.